Selections from Appendix 2 of the 13th Greatest of Centuries by James Walsh. 14 Chapters That Might Have Been. 1. America in the 13th Century. To most people it would seem quite out of the question that a chapter on America in the 13th century might have been written. One of the most surprising chapters for most readers in the previous edition was that on great explorers and the foundation of geography, for it was a revelation to learn that 13th century travelers had anticipated all of our discoveries in the far and in the Near East 7 centuries ago. Certain documents have turned up, however, which make it very clear that, with the same motives as those which urged Eastern travelers, Europeans went just as far toward the West at this time. Documents found in the Vatican archives in 1903 and exhibited at St. Louis in 1904 have set at rest finally and absolutely the long disputed question of the discovery of America by the Norsemen, and in connection with these the story of America in the 13th century might well have been told. There is a letter from Pope Innocent III dated February 13, 1206, addressed to the Archbishop of Norway, who held jurisdiction over Greenland, which shows not only the presence of the Norsemen on the American continent at this time, but also that they had been there for a considerable period, and that there were a number of churches and pastors and large flocks in whom the Roman See had a lively interest. There are Americana from 3 other popes of the 13th century. John the 21st wrote in 1276, Nicholas III 2 letters, one dated January 31st, 1279, and another June 9th, 1279, and Martin III wrote 1282. We have inserted on the opposite page a reproduction of a portion of the first papal document extant relating to America, the letter of Pope Innocent III, taken from, quote, the Norse discovery of America, close quote. The word Greenlandi underscored indicates the subject. The writing, as an example of the chirography of the century, is of interest. 2. A representative upper house. In most historical attempts at government by the people, it has been recognized that legislation is better balanced if there are 2 chambers in the lawmaking body, one directly elected by the people, the other indirectly chosen and representing important vested interests that are likely to make its members conservative. The initiative for legislation comes as a rule from the direct representatives of the people, while the upper chamber represses radical lawmaking or sudden changes in legislative policy, yet does not hamper too much the progress of democracy. During the last few years, a crisis in English politics has led to a very general demand for a modification of the status of the House of Lords, while almost similar conditions have led to the beginning at least of a similar demand for the modification of our Senate in this country. Both these upper chambers have come to represent vested interests in too great a degree. The House of Lords has been the subject of special depreciation. The remark is sometimes made that it is unfortunate that England is weighted down by this political incubus, the House of Lords, which is spoken of as a heritage from the Middle Ages. The general impression, of course, is that the English House of Lords, as at present constituted, comes down from the oldest times of constitutional government in England. Nothing could well be more untrue than any such idea. The old upper chamber of England, the medieval House of Lords, was an eminently representative body. Out of the 625 or more of members of the English House of Lords at the present time, about 550 hold their seats by heredity. Only about 75 are in some sense elective. At least 1/2 of these elected peers, however, must be chosen from the hereditary nobility of Ireland and Scotland. Nearly 19/20 of the membership of the House of Lords, as at present constituted, owe their place in national legislation entirely to heredity. Until the Reformation so-called, this was not so. More than one half of the English House of Lords, a good working majority, consisted of the Lords spiritual. Besides the bishops and archbishops, there were the abbots and priors of monasteries, and the masters of religious orders. These men as a rule had come up from the people. They had risen to their positions by intellectual abilities and by administrative capacity. The abbots and other superiors of religious orders had been chosen by their monks as a rule because, having shown that they knew how to rule themselves, they were deemed most fitting to rule over others. Even in our day, when the Church occupies nothing like the position in the hearts of the masses that she held in the ages of faith, our Catholic cardinals, archbishops, and bishops, both here and in England, are chosen as members of arbitration boards to settle strikes and other social difficulties, because it is felt that the working class has full confidence in them, and that they are thoroughly representative of the spirit of democracy. In England, Cardinal Manning served more than once in critical social conditions. In this country, we have had a series of such examples. From these we can better understand what the Lords spiritual represented in the English House of Lords. There were abuses, though they were not so nearly so frequent as were thought, by which unworthy men sometimes reached such positions, for men abuse even the best things. But in general, these clerical members of the House of Lords were the chosen intellectual and moral products of the kingdom. Since they were without families, they had less temptation to serve personal interests, and besides, they had received a lifelong training in unselfishness, and the best might be expected of them. For an ideal second chamber, I know none that can compare with this old English House of Lords of the Middle Ages. How much it was responsible for the foundation of the liberties of which the English-speaking people are deservedly so proud, and which have been treated in some detail in the chapter on Origins of Law, would be interesting to trace. 3. The Parish and Training in Citizenship. Mr. Toulmin Smith in his book on the parish, and Don Gasquet in his volume on The Parish Before the Reformation, have shown what a magnificent institution for popular self-government was the English medieval parish, and how much this contributed to the solution of important social problems, and to the creation of a true democratic spirit. Mr. Toulmin Smith calls particular attention to the fact that when local self-government gets out of the hands of a people of a neighborhood, personal civic energy goes to sleep. The feeling of mutual responsibility of the men of the place is lost, to the great detriment of their larger citizenship in municipality and nation. In the parish, however, forming a separate community of which the members had rights and duties, the primal solid basis for government, the parish authorities took charge of the highways, the roads, the paths, the health, the police, the constabulary, and the fires of their neighborhood. They kept, besides, a registry of births and deaths and marriages. When these essentially local concerns are controlled in large bodies, the liability to abuse at once becomes easy and political corruption sets in. He mentions, besides many parochial institutions, a parochial-friendly society for loans on security, parish guilds for insurance, and many other phases of that thoroughly organized mutual aid so characteristic of the Middle Ages. These parishes became completely organized so as to be thoroughly democratic and representative of all the possibilities of local self-government under King Edward at the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century. Reverend Augustus Jessup in After the Great Pillage tells the story of how the parishes were broken up as a consequence of the confiscation of their endowment during the so-called Reformation. The quotation from him may be found in Appendix 3 in the section on how it all stopped. Toulmin Smith is not so emphatic, but he is scarcely less explicit than Jessup. Quote, The attempts of ecclesiastical authority to encroach on the civil authorities of the parish have been more successful since the Reformation." Close quote. As a matter of fact, at that time all government became centralized, and complete contradiction though it may seem to be of what is sometimes declared the place of the Reformation in the history of human liberty, the genuine democratic institutions of England were to a great extent impaired by the Reform, and an autocracy which later developed into an autocratic aristocracy largely took its place. Out of that England has gradually lifted itself during the 19th century. Even now, however, as pointed out in the preceding chapter that might have been, the House of Lords is not at all what it was in the 13th and 14th century, when the majority of its members were lords spiritual, men who had come up from the masses as a rule. 4. The chance to rise. We are very prone to think that even though there may have been excellent opportunities for the higher education in the 13th century, and in many ways an ideal education of the masses, still there was one great social drawback in those times: the lack of opportunity for men of humble birth to rise to higher stations. Nothing, however, is less true. There probably never was a time when even members of the poorest families might rise more readily and rapidly to the highest positions in the land. The sons of village merchants and village artisans, nay, the sons and grandsons of farmers bound to the soil, could by educational success become clergymen in various ranks, and by attaining a bishopric or the position of abbot or prior of a monastery, reach a seat in the House of Lords. Most of the Lord High Chancellors of England during the Middle Ages, and some of them are famous for their genius as canon and civil lawyers, for their diplomatic abilities and their breadth of view and capacity as administrators, were the sons of humble parents. Take the single example of Stratford, the detail of whose inhabitants' lives, because of the greatness of one of them, have attracted more attention than those of any other town of corresponding size in England. At the beginning of the 14th century, it is only what we would call a village, and it probably did not have 3,000 inhabitants, if indeed the number was not less than 2,000. In his book, Shakespeare the Boy, Mr. Rolfe calls attention to certain conditions that interest us in the old village. He tells us of what happened as a result of the development of liberty in the 13th century. Quote, "Villenage gradually disappeared in the reign of Edward VII, and those who had been subject to it became free tenants, paying definite rents for house and land. 3 natives of the town, who, after the fashion of the time, took their surnames from the place of their birth, rose to high positions in the church, one becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, and the others respectively Bishops of London and Chichester. John of Stratford and Robert of Stratford were brothers, and Ralph of Stratford was their nephew. John and Robert were both for a time Chancellors of England, and there is no other instance of 2 brothers attaining that high office in succession." Close quote. To many people, the fact that the avenue to rise was through the clergy more than in any other way will be disappointing. One advantage, however, that the old people would insist that they had from their system was that these men, having no direct descendants, were less likely to pursue selfish aims and more likely to try to secure the benefit of the community than are those who in our time rise through the legal profession. The Lord High Chancellors of recent time have all been lawyers. Would not most of the world confess that the advantage was with the medieval peoples? President Woodrow Wilson of Princeton realized sympathetically this great element of saving democracy in the Middle Ages, and has paid worthy tribute to it. He said, quote, "The only reason why government did not suffer dry rot in the Middle Ages under the aristocratic systems which then prevailed was that the men who were efficient instruments of government were drawn from the church, from that great church, that body which we now distinguish from other church bodies as the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church then, as now, was a great democracy. There was no peasant so humble that he might not become a priest, and no priest so obscure that he might not become Pope of Christendom, and every chancellery in Europe was ruled by those learned, trained, and accomplished men, the priesthood of that great and then dominant church. And so what kept government alive in the Middle Ages was this constant rise of the sap from the bottom, from the rank and file of the great body of the people through the open channels of the Roman Catholic priesthood." Close quote. 5. Insurance. Insurance is usually supposed to be a modern idea, representing one of those developments of the capitalization of mutual risks of life, property, and the like that have come as a consequence of modern progress. The insurance system of the Middle Ages, the organization of which came in the 13th century, is therefore extremely interesting. It was accomplished, as was every form of cooperation and coordination of effort, through special guilds or through the trade of merchant guilds. Among the objects of the guilds enumerated by Toulmin Smith is insurance against loss by fire. This was paid through the particular guild to which the merchant belonged, or in the case of the artisan through a special guild which he joined for the purpose. Provision was made, however, for much more than insurance by fire. Our fire insurance companies are probably several centuries old, so also are our insurance arrangements against shipwreck. Other features of insurance, however, are much more recent. Practically all of these were in active existence during the Middle Ages, though they disappeared with the so-called Reformation, and then did not come into existence again for several centuries, and indeed not until our own time. The old guilds, for instance, provided insurance against loss from flood, a feature of insurance that has not, so far as I know, developed in our time. Against loss of robbery, our burglary insurance is quite recent. Against loss by the fall of a house, by imprisonment, and then also insurance against the loss of cattle and farm products. All the features of life insurance were also in existence. The partial disability clauses of life or accident insurance policies are recent developments. In the old days there is insurance against the loss of sight, against the loss of a limb, or any other form of crippling. The deaf and dumb might be insured so as to secure an income for them, and corresponding relief for leprosy might be obtained, so that if one were set apart from the community by the law requiring segregation of lepers, there might be provision for food and lodging, even though productive work has become impossible. In a word, the insurance system of the Middle Ages was thoroughly developed. It was not capitalistic. The charges were only enough to maintain the system, and not such as to provide large percentage returns on invested stock and on bonds, and the accumulation of huge surpluses that almost inevitably lead to gross abuses. What is best in our modern system of insurance is an imitation of the older methods. Certain of the trade insurance companies which assume a portion of the risk on mills, factories, and the like are typical examples. They know the conditions, enforce proper precautions, keep an absolute check on suspicious losses, accumulate only a moderate surplus, and present very few opportunities for insurance abuses. The same thing is true for the fraternal societies that conduct life insurance. When properly managed, they represent the lowest possible cost and the best efficiency, with least opportunities for fraud, and without any temptations to interfere with legislation and any allurements for legislators to spend their time making strike and graft bills instead of doing legislative work. 6. Old age pensions. This generation has occupied itself much with the question of old age pensions. Probably most people feel that this is the first time in the world's history that such arrangements have been made. The movement is supposed to represent a recent development of humanitarian purpose and to be a feature of recent philanthropic evolution. It is rather interesting, in the light of that idea, to see how well they accomplish this same purpose in the 13th and 14th centuries. In our own time, it has been a government affair with all the possibilities of abuse that there are in a huge pension system, and surely no country knows it better than we do here in America. The old countries, Germany and France, have established a contributing system of pension. This was the model for their system of caring for the old and the disabled in the Middle Ages. Toulmin Smith cites a rule of one of the guilds, which gives us exactly the status of the old age disability pension question. After a workman has been 7 years a member, the guild assured him a livelihood in case of disability from any cause. When we recall that employer as well as employee as a rule belonged to the guild, and this was a real mutual organization in which there was a sharing of the various risks of life, we see how eminently well adapted to avoid abuses this old system was. Where the pensioners appeal to a government pension system, abuses are almost inevitable. There is the constant temptation to exploit the system on the part of the pensioners, because they have the feeling that if they do not, others will. Then the investigation of each particular case is difficult, and favoritism and graft of various kinds inevitably find its way in. Where the pension is paid by a small body of fellow workmen, the investigation is easy. The temptation to exploit does not readily find place, and while abuses are to some extent inevitable, these are small in amount, and not likely to be frequent. Friends and neighbors know conditions, and men are not pauperized by the system. And if, after an injury that seemed at first so disabling as to be permanent, the pensioner should improve enough to be able to get back to work, or at least to do something to support himself, the system is elastic enough so that he is not likely to be tempted to continue to live on others rather than on his own efforts. 7. The ways and means of charity, organized charity. Most of us would be apt to think that our modern methods of obtaining funds for charitable purposes represented definite developments, and that at least special features of our collections for charity were our own invention. In recent years, the value of being able to reach a great many people, even for small amounts, has been particularly recognized. Tag Day is one manifestation of that. Everyone in a neighborhood is asked to contribute a small amount for a particular charitable purpose, and the whole collection usually runs up to a snug sum. Practices very similar to these were quite common in the 13th century. As in our own time, it was the women who collected the money. A rope, for instance, was stretched across a marketplace where traffic was busy, and everyone who passed was required to pay a toll for charity. Occasionally the rope was stretched across a bridge, and the tolls were collected on a particular day each year. Other forms of charitable accumulation resembled ours in many respects. Entertainments of various kinds were given for charity, and special collections were made during the exhibition of mystery plays, mostly to pay the expenses of the representation, and the surplus to go to the charities of the particular guild. Most of the charity, however, was organized. Indeed, it is the organization of charity during the 13th century that represents the best feature of its fraternalism. The needy were cared for by the guilds themselves. There were practically no poorhouses, and if a man was willing to work and had already shown this willingness, there were definite bureaus that would help him at least to feed his family while he was out of work. This system, however, was flexible enough to provide also for the ne'er-do-wells, the tramps, the beggars, but they were given not money, but tokens which enabled them to obtain the necessaries of life without being able to abuse charity. The committees of the guilds consulted in various ways among themselves and with church wardens, so as to be sure that, while all the needy were receiving help, no one was abusing charity by drawing help from a number of different quarters. Of course, they did not have the problem of large city life that we have, and so their comparatively simple organization of charity sufficed for all the needs of the time, and at the same time anticipated our methods. 8. Scientific universities. In the first edition of this book, I called attention to the fact that science, even in our sense of physical science, was, in spite of impressions to the contrary, a favorite subject for students and teachers in the early universities. What might have been insisted on, however, is that these old universities were scientific universities resembling our own so closely in their devotion to science as to differ from them only in certain unimportant aspects. Because the universities for 3 centuries before the 19th had been occupied mainly with classical studies, we are prone to think that these were the main subjects of university teaching for all the centuries before. Nothing could well be less true. The undergraduate studies consisted of the 7 liberal arts so-called, though these were largely studied from the scientific standpoint. The quotation from Professor Huxley makes this very clear. What we would now call the graduate studies consisted of metaphysics, in which considerable physics were studied, astronomy, medicine, above all mathematics, and then the ethical sciences, under which were studied what we now call ethics, politics, and economics. The picture of these medieval universities, as I have given them in my lecture on medieval scientific universities in Education, How Old the New, makes this very clear. The interest and studies were very like those of our own time, only the names for them being different. Nature study was a favorite subject, and, as I have pointed out in The Popes and Science, Dante must be considered as a great nature student, for he was able to draw the most exquisite figures from details of knowledge of living things with which few poets are familiar. The books of the professors of the 13th century which have been preserved, those of Albert Magnus, Roger Bacon, Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and others, make it very clear that scientific teaching was the main occupation of the university faculties, while the preservation of these huge tomes by the diligent copying of disciples shows how deeply interested were their pupils in the science of the time. 9. Medical teaching and professional standards. At all times in the history of education, the standards of scientific education and the institutions of learning can be best judged from the condition of the medical schools. When the medical sciences are taken seriously, when thorough preparation is demanded before their study may be taken up, when 4 or 5 years of attention to theoretic and practical medicine are required for graduation, and when the professors are writing textbooks that are to attract attention for generations afterwards, then there is always a thoroughly scientific temper in the university itself. Medicine is likely to suffer first whenever there is neglect of science. The studies of the German historians Puschmann, Bagel, Nuremberg, and Sudhoff in recent years have made it very clear that the medical schools of the universities of the 13th century were maintaining high standards. The republication of old texts, especially in France, has called attention to the magnificent publications of their professors, while a review of their laws and regulations confirms the idea of the good work that was being done. Gurlt, in his History of Surgery, has reviewed the textbooks of Roger and Roland and the Four Masters, of William of Salicet, and La France, and of many others, in a way to make it very clear that these men were excellent teachers. When we discover that 3 years of preparatory university work was required before the study of medicine could be begun, and 4 years of medical studies were required, with a subsequent year of practice under a physician's direction, before a license for independent practice could be issued, then the scientific character of the medical schools, and therefore of the universities to which they were attached, is placed beyond all doubt. These are the terms of the law issued by the Emperor Frederick II for the 2 Sicilies. That in substance it applied to other countries we learn from the fact that the charters of medical schools granted by the popes at this time require proper university preliminary studies, and 4 or 5 years at medicine before the degree of doctor could be given. We know besides that in the cities only those who were graduates of properly recognized medical schools were allowed to practice medicine, so that there was every encouragement for the maintenance of professional standards. Indeed, strange as it may seem to our generation, the standards of the 13th century in medical education were much higher than our own, and their medical schools were doing fine work. 10. Magnetism. For proper understanding of the 13th century scholars, it is especially important to appreciate their thoroughly scientific temper of mind, their powers of observation, and their successful attainments in science. I know no more compendious way of reaching the knowledge of these qualities in the medieval mind than a study of the letters of Peregrinus, which we would in our time call a monograph on magnetism. Brother Potomanian, in his chapter in Makers of Electricity, on Peregrinus and Columbus, sums up the very interesting contributions of this medieval student of magnetism to the subject. The list of chapters alone in Peregrinus's monograph makes it very clear how deep were his interest and how thoroughly practical his investigations. They are, quote, Part 1, Chapter 1, Purpose of this work. 2. Qualifications of the experimenter. 3. Characteristics of a good lodestone. 4. How to distinguish the poles of a lodestone. 5. How to tell which pole is north and which is south. 6. How one lodestone attracts another. 7. How iron touched by a lodestone turns towards the poles of the world. 8. How a lodestone attracts iron. 9. Why the north pole of one lodestone attracts the south pole of another, and vice versa. 10. An inquiry into the natural virtue of the lodestone. Part 2, Chapter 1. Construction of an instrument for measuring the azimuth of the sun, the moon, or any star then in the horizon. 2. Construction of a better instrument for the same purpose. 3. The art of making a wheel of perpetual motion. Close quote. In order to illustrate what Peregrinus accomplished, it has seemed worthwhile to reproduce here the sketches which illustrate his epistle. We have the double pivoted needle and the first pivoted compass. In the light of certain recent events, a passage from the New Naval History or Complete Review of the British Marine is of special interest. It illustrates perhaps the new confidence that came to men in sailing to long distances as a result of the realization of the practical value of the magnetic needle during the 13th century. Quote, in the year 1360, it is recorded that a friar of Oxford called Nicholas de Lena, being a good astronomer, went in company with others to the most northern island, and thence traveled alone, and that he went to the North Pole by means of his skill in magic, or the black art. But this magic or black art may probably have been nothing more than a knowledge of the magnetic needle or compass, found out about 60 years before, though not in common use until many years after. Close quote. 11. Biological theories, evolution, recapitulation. Of course, only those who are quite unfamiliar with the history of philosophic thought are apt to think that the theory of evolution is modern. Serious students of biology are familiar with the long history of the theory, and especially its anticipations by the Greeks. Very few know, however, that certain phases of evolutionary theory attracted not a little attention from the scholastic philosophers. It would not be difficult to find the expressions in Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus that would serve to show that they thought not only of the possibility of some very intimate relation of species, but of developmental connections. The great teacher of the time, St. Thomas Aquinas, has some striking expressions in the matter which deserve to be quoted because he is the most important representative of the philosophy and science of the century, and the one whose works most influenced succeeding generations. In the lecture on medieval scientific universities published in Education, How Old the New, I called particular attention to this phase of St. Thomas's teaching. Two quotations will serve to make it clear here. Professor Osborne, in From the Greeks to Darwin, quotes Aquinas' commentary on St. Augustine's opinion with regard to the origin of things as they are. Augustine declared that the Creator had simply brought into life the seeds of things and given these the power to develop. Aquinas, expounding Augustine, says, quote, "As to production of plants, Augustine holds a different view, for some say that on the third day plants were actually produced, each in his kind, a view favored by the superficial reading of Scripture. But Augustine says that the earth is then said to have brought forth grass and trees causaliter, that is, it then received power to produce them. For in those days God made creation primarily or causaliter, and then rested from his work." Close quote. Like expressions might be quoted from him, and other writers of the 13th century might well be cited in confirmation of the fact that while these great teachers of the Middle Ages thoroughly recognized the necessity for creation to begin with and the placing by the Creator of some power in living things that enables them to develop, they were by no means bound by the thought that all living species were due to special creations. They even did not hesitate to teach the possibility of the lower order of living things at least coming into existence by spontaneous generation, and would probably have found no difficulty in accepting a theory of descent with the limitations that most scientific men of our generation are prone to demand for it. Lest it should be thought that this is a mere accidental agreement with modern thought, due much more to a certain looseness of terms than to actual similarity of view, it seems well to point out how close St. Thomas came to that thought in modern biology, which is probably considered to be one of our most distinct modern contributions to the theory of evolution, though in recent years serious doubts have been thrown on it. It is expressed by the formula of Herbert Spencer, quote, "Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny." Close quote. According to this, the completed being repeats in the course of its development the history of the race, that is to say, the varying phases of fetal development, from the single cell in which it originates up to the perfect being of the special type as it is born into the world, retrace the history by which from the single cell being the creature in question has gradually developed. It is very curious to find that St. Thomas Aquinas, in his teaching with regard to the origin and development of the human being, says almost exactly what the most ardent supporters of this so-called fundamental biogenetic law proclaimed during the latter half of the 19th century, thinking they were expressing an absolutely new thought. He says that, quote, "The higher a form is in the scale of being, and the farther it is removed from mere material form, the more intermediate forms must be passed through before the final perfect form is reached. Therefore, in the generation of animal and man, these having the most perfect forms, there occur many intermediate forms in generation and consequently destruction, because the generation of one being is the destruction of another." Close quote. St. Thomas draws the ultimate conclusions from this doctrine without hesitation. He proclaims that the human material is first animated by a vegetative soul or principle of life, and then by an animal soul, and only ultimately, when the matter has been properly prepared for it, by a rational soul. He says, quote, "The vegetative soul, therefore, which is first in embryo while it lives the life of a plant, is destroyed, and there succeeds a more perfect soul, which is at once nutrient and sentient, and for that time the embryo lives the life of an animal. Upon destruction of this, there succeeds the rational soul, infused from without." Close quote. 12. The Pope of the Century. The absence of a chapter on the Pope of the Century has always seemed a lacuna in the previous editions of this book. Pope Innocent III, whose pontificate began just before the century opened and occupied the first 15 years of it, well deserves a place beside Francis the Saint, Thomas the Scholar, Dante the Poet, and Louis the Monarch of this great century. More than any other single individual, he was responsible for the great development of the intellectual life that took place. But at the same time, his wonderfully broad influence enabled him to initiate many of the movements that meant most for human uplift and for the alleviation of suffering in this period. It was in councils of the Church summoned by him that the important legislation was passed requiring the development of schools, the foundation of colleges in every diocese, and of universities in important metropolitan sees. What he accomplished for hospitals has been well told by Virchow, from whom I quote a magnanimous tribute in the chapter on the foundation of city hospitals. The legislation of Innocent III did much to encourage and yet to regulate properly the religious orders of the time engaged in charitable work. Besides doing so much for charity, he was a stern upholder of morals. As more than one king of the time realized while Innocent was pope, there could be no trifling with marriage vows. On the other hand, while Innocent was so stern as to the enforcement of marriage laws, his wonderfully judicious character and his care for the weak and the innocent can be particularly noted in his treatment of the children in these cases. While he compelled recalcitrant kings to take back the wives they would repudiate and put away other women who had won their affections, he did not hesitate to make due provision, as far as possible, for the illegitimate children. P.D. Gordon, in his recent life of Pope Innocent III, notes that he invariably legitimized the offspring of these illegal unions of kings, and even declared them capable of succession. He would not visit the guilt of the parent on the innocent offspring. Innocent did more to encourage the idea of international arbitration than anyone up to his time. During his period, more than once, he was the arbitrator to whom rival national claims that might have led to war were referred. Probably his biggest claim on our admiration in the modern time is his attitude toward the Jews. In this he is centuries ahead of his time, and indeed, the policy that he laid down is far ahead of what is accorded to them by many of the nations even at the present time, and it must not be forgotten that it is only during the past 100 years that the Jew has come to have any real privileges comparable to those accorded to other men. At the time when the Jew had no real rights in law, Innocent insisted on according them all the rights of men. His famous edict in this regard is well known. Let no Christian by violence compel them to come dissenting or unwilling to baptism. Further, let no Christian venture maliciously to harm their persons without a judgment of the civil power, to carry off their property or change their good customs which they have had hitherto in that district which they inhabit. Close quote. When, in addition to all this, it is recalled that he was a distinguished scholar and graduate of the University of Paris, looked up to as one of the intellectual geniuses of the time, the author of a treatise on the contempt of the world, at a time when the kings of the earth were obeying him, known for his personal piety and for his thorough regulation of his own household, something of the greatness of the man will be appreciated. No wonder that historians who have taken up the special study of his career have always been won over to deep personal admiration of him, and though many of them began prejudiced in his regard, practically all of them were converted to be his sincere admirers. 13. International arbitration. During the Peace Conference in New York in 1908, I was on the program with Mr. William T. Stead of London, the editor of the English Review of Reviews, who was very much interested in the volume on the 13th century, and who suggested that one chapter in the book should have been devoted to the consideration of what was accomplished for peace and for international arbitration during this century. There is no doubt that there developed, as the result of many papal decrees, a greater tendency than has existed ever before or since to refer quarrels between nations that would ordinarily end in war to decision by some selected umpire, usually the Pope as the head of the Christian Church, to which all the nations of the civilized world belonged, was selected as the arbitrator. This international arbitration, strengthened by the decrees of Pope Innocent III, Pope Honorius III, and Pope Alexander III, developed in a way that is well worthwhile studying, and that has deservedly been the subject of careful investigation since the present peace movement began. Certainly, the outlook for the securing of peace by international arbitration was better at this time than it has been at any time since. What a striking example, for instance, is the choice of King Louis of France as the umpire in the dispute between the barons and the King of England, which might have led to war. Louis's position with regard to the empire and the papacy was to a great extent that of a pacificator, and his influence for peace was felt everywhere throughout Europe. The spirit of the century was all for arbitration and the adjudication of international as well as international difficulties by peaceful means. 14. Bible revision. Most people will be quite sure that at least the question of Bible revision with critical study of text and comparative investigation of sources was reserved for our time. The two orders of friars founded in the early part of the 13th century, however, devoted themselves to the task of supplying to the people a thoroughly reliable edition of the Scriptures. The first systematic revision was made by the Dominicans about 1236. After 20 years, this revision was set aside as containing too many errors, and another Dominican correction replaced it. Then came that great scholar, Hugh of St. Cher, known later as the Cardinal of Santa Sabina, the author of the first great biblical concordance. His Bible studies did much to clarify obscurities in the text. Sometime about 1240, he organized a commission of friars for the revision of what was known as the Paris Exemplar, the Bible text that was most in favor at that time. The aim of Hugh of St. Cher was to establish the old Vulgate of St. Jerome, the text which received this name during this century, but with such revision as would make this version correspond as nearly as possible to the Hebrew and the Greek. The activity on the part of the Dominicans was rivaled by the Franciscans. We might not expect to find the great scientist Roger Bacon as a biblical scholar and reviser, but such he was, working with Wilmers de Mara, to whom, according to Father Denifle, late the librarian of the Vatican Library, must be attributed the title given him by Roger Bacon of Sapientissimus Vir. The Dominicans, under the leadership of Hugh of St. Cher, with high ideals, had hoped to achieve a perfect primitive text. The version made by de Mara, however, with the approval and advice of Bacon, was only meant to bring out St. Jerome's text as perfectly as possible. These two revisions, made in the 13th century, are typical of all the efforts that men have made since in that direction. Contrary to usual present-day impressions, they are characterized by critical scholarship and probably represent as great a contribution to biblical lore as was made by any other century. End of selections from the second appendix of the 13th Greatest of Centuries by James Walsh.